Okay, so we have, before coffee, we've been talking about the European standard, and we mentioned it over and over again, and we kind of slipped in sometimes words like SIAS, which probably few of you know what it is, but it's, it's an accident in this line of work to use abbreviations that no one knew. No, that's how we impress on people, we think. I will give you now a walkthrough through this European standard. You have coffee. You hope you didn't have too many cookies so you fall asleep. This is a challenge for me too. And so the European standard, this is how it looks when it's printed. I can hand it out, see if you can send it around if you want to see it in reality, because it's been referred to quite often, but few have read it. First of all, the directive mentioned this European standard. And the directive was published, I think it was 2014. At that point, the European standard didn't exist. So it was kind of a gambling from the parliament to refer to a standard which was still not in existence. And everybody who's been involved in standardization knows that it's almost impossible to be done in time. So it always drags out because people are fighting, and it's really it's not as nice environment as it's sometimes people think to work with standardization. It's a lot of debate and different of opinions. However, the directive, it did say in Article 3, in Article 7 that everybody needs to comply with this standard. In Article 3, it says that the European Commission shall request that the relevant European standardization organization draft a European standard for the semantic data model of the core elements of an electronic invoice. So this is a few things here which are of interest. European standard organizations, there are several of those. So it's more or less like a call for tenders. So they create a request, and then the standardization organization pick up, we can do it. That's how it works when the European Commission requests standardization. Also, in the directive, it says the semantic data model of the core elements of an electronic invoice. So the core. That's something that we will come back to. What does it mean that it's the core elements? And then also it says that the European Standard Organization shall provide a list of these syntaxes, the technical formats for which these semantic data elements should be carried. The standard organization which picked this challenge up was CEN, European Committee for Standardization. CEN, a committee was created called TC434. It has over 100 committee members from 31 countries. So it's a pretty large technical committee to agree on every detail in those documents. And as you can see, there are a lot of details. Any participation in this work needs to go through your national standardization organization. And I think from Ireland is Edmund Gray was participating, and you were participating. Yeah. What's impressive was that the committee was able to finalize all these documents, all these standards, more or less on time. It was a marginal run, 2 months, I think, something like that over time. And then when it comes to these standards, there are different types. The heaviest canon available is what's called a European norm or European standard. That is the type of document which I am now sending around, the semantic data model. That takes a long time to develop. It requires a high level of consensus. There is a vote in all of Europe. Of all the member states need to vote on their acceptance of it. The normative status is therefore also very high, so you can refer to it from directives, for example. But there are other types of technical specifications. Technical specifications and reports, these are a little bit, they are still quite complicated to create, but they are comparably more agile. And then we also have something called workshop agreements. which is also even lower level. But the European standard is the blue one up here, the semantic model. The syntax list is a technical specification. If you take a list of all the standards being created by TC434, the current situation is that we have the semantic model, we have the list of syntaxes, then there are a number of other specifications such as methodology for how to connect this model, the business terms, with the syntax. It's like a methodology. And then the actual syntax bindings. So in the syntax binding, you can see that, okay, the invoice number goes into that field or position in the specific syntax. And in the other syntax, it goes there. And so for every business term, it has a pointer to where in the syntax that element is located. So these are specifications which are very relevant for the ones implementing the technical aspects, the service providers or the ERP systems. They will look at these syntax bindings. For you, this standard is of relevance, then mostly the semantic model, the business terms. So I'm going now to take a look at some of the content here, so that you get an understanding of the scope and what level of detail we are talking about. So I'm going to specifically look at what we mean with the concept of a core invoice, a little bit about the business processes supported in the standard, and then I will give some examples of the business terms and rules. And I will mention something about what's called the core invoice usage specification, or the SIUS. And then in the end, I will give you examples of other countries and how they've been thinking about implementation of this. So this I already showed you, that the standard is relevant not only for how to for the information to be exchanged, but also how the systems are handling the information. Your user interface will be has to be verified that does it comply to the standard. For example, I can give you an example of payment means. In Sweden, we have several ways of requesting a payment. So the supplier can say, either you use SEPA and IBAN, the account number, or you use any of two domestic payment systems, Bank Gyro and Post Gyro. These are two legacy systems that we've used. So these three are the three options available. But in the new standard, you can only provide one in an invoice. You can't provide all three, as we used to do. So that has relevance for the supplier. When entering the invoice, he needs to be aware that it's only one of these that's going to be sent to the receiver. This is one of the challenges that we have now, because then you need to know. So if it's a cross-border payment, you have to provide your IBAN. But if it's a domestic, then you perhaps choose one of the legacy systems. So it has relevance on that level, and the users get affected by this. And then the business processes, I mentioned crediting, for example, and the technical format for the exchange. And the e-delivery as PEPAL is not part of the standard itself. Okay, so I mentioned also that in the directive it said it was the core elements of an invoice. So why do we have to have a core? Why not just look at all invoices in Europe and just put them on top of each other, and then just a standard which contains all of that? That would be good. But the problem is that the business environment is very, very diverse, and the information exchange in the different industries differs a lot. And if you add all of this together, you will get an invoice with thousands and thousands of business terms in it. In the steel industry, you have information about the size of a steel, I don't know what it was called, and the thickness and the quality of steel, and all of that is part of the invoice. And that's just the steel industry. You have similar requirements in every specific industry. So we can't have an approach where we just collect every requirement and then say, this is the standard. No one would be able to present that in a user interface, or it will be very complex. Lots of information might go unnoticed. For example, if you can't support all the business terms, what would happen if someone sent some of them? They will not be shown to you in the user interface. You might be lost when archiving and so on. So that means that we have to have a smaller model, but it should still be useful. One approach would be, okay, let's only take the mandatory elements of an invoice, elements that are always in an invoice. But then if you start calculating, you will see that, okay, there is always an invoice number and always an issue date. But then there is not much more where it's always available, because payment instructions, you have that in some invoices, but not all, because you might have that pre-agreed, or you're using some other mandate, for example. Or prices, okay, there's always a price, but sometimes in an invoice it's just a summary of, there will be very, very few elements if you would only take what's always available. And no one could use only that. You would still then have to extend on top of those mandatory elements. So the conclusion was that, okay, it needs to be as small as possible, but still usable. And that is easier said than done. Because everybody thinks their business terms are the most relevant. And just for giving an understanding, and this is, you're not supposed to see all the details in this slide, but I still give you a picture. What this represents is the invoice line information in one of the international standards called UBL. And as you can see, we have the invoice in the center here. We have the line, and then this whole tree grows out and have product information, the item information. There's information about if the product is hazardous. You have the price information. You have allowances and charges, delivery information with addresses. All this is on an invoice line, which we normally only see as a line number, the product, the quantity, and the price. That's how a paper invoice normally contains. But on the international standards, and this is a consequence of that different industries have so specific needs for their specific products, for example. So what happens is that only a few of these elements or groups of information is necessary, and only a few of these business terms is considered to be core elements. And now we can also see that the risk, if we didn't have a European standard pointing out these core elements, the likelihood that two different projects working in isolation, one Irish and one from Netherlands, would come to the same conclusion on what they think is core, they would very, very likely come to different conclusions. So their e-invoicing solutions wouldn't work together because we are not using the same business terms, so we have different positions in the syntaxes. So what the European standard provides is both the business terms and exactly where to put them, and to say what is expected that everybody can understand. So the committee defined a few guiding principles for how to decide if a business term goes in the core invoice or if it should be excluded from the core invoice. Some of these guiding principles are pretty fluffy, like it should be easier to use than a paper invoice. I don't know exactly how that is, how you use that principle, but I guess the point is that it should be easy to implement, it should be user-friendly. And that elements that helps automation should be available. So there were these guiding principles. Then the process of creating the standard was a very top-down approach, starting from having these guiding principles as a measuring tool to see if something should go in or out. And then the committee members would provide the information that they thought should go into an invoice. Based on that, a list of processes and functions were defined. So an invoice, it should be possible to have an invoice with a credit note. And it should be possible to have an invoice which can be automatically matched to an order. Self-billed invoice should be supported. and self-billed credit note, and so on and so on. So there was a list. Based on that list, a list of requirement was created, and you can see this if you have time when you're looking at the document I sent out or handed out, that this requirement gives the business requirement behind a specific piece of information. And based on this list of requirements, the actual business terms were derived and rules about those business terms. So when I say this top-down approach, meaning that it started from the business processes and then based on that analyzing and coming in the end to the conclusion of the business terms. It also helps and gives a better understanding. So if you're looking at the business term, you're able to track it back all the way to the process for where this business term is relevant. So there's a list of these business processes. I mentioned some of them. We also have prepaid invoices, where you have a dispatch advice, and so on. And then we have the business requirements, as I also mentioned. As you can see, these are also numbered. And a requirement could be, for example, information to trace a single related purchase order from the document. And that points to which business process is relevant. And information to trace a single contract and the underlying call for tenders from the document. That could be, these are requirements that were put into the work. And based on those requirements, the data model, the semantic model, is then created. And this is a graphical presentation of that. And I will now go through some key elements, just to give you an impression of what are the types of business terms contained here. And this is not, of course, all of it, but starting from the top, we have in the invoice, we have an invoice number, an issue date, a type code, and a currency code. These are examples of elements. You can see in the end it says 1-to-1 here. That means that you have to provide at least one invoice number and a maximum of one invoice number. That's a technical way of saying it's mandatory. So it could also be that at least one and maximum unbounded, so then you can repeat it. So we have references to preceding invoices in case of crediting. On the seller information, we have the seller's name, and sometimes the seller has one official name and then a trading name. So then that's an optional, minimum 0 trading names, maximum 1. Identifiers being used, such as your organization number. I don't know what types of identifiers you're using in Ireland for companies, but typically the one you're using in communication with authorities and so on. That's your unique ID.
There's no one, so that's a problem. VAT is one that companies would use, but identification scheme is an issue we have to tackle.
Interesting, yeah. So a VAT number is an example, but that only goes for those who are registered for VAT. So. A legal registration identifier, that's another of these formal identifiers. And possibly additional legal information. I mentioned a few cases of this before, like in Sweden, where we have to provide a proof that we pay taxes and stuff. And then we have the buyer, payee. If there's another one receiving the money than the seller for factoring. Seller tax representative party, that's when someone else is collecting the VAT. Delivery information, payment instructions, and in the payment instructions there are a type code saying if it's a SEPA payment, for example, direct debit or credit transfer, and remittance information if you want to have automate the or what's it called? Well, when you're checking off that all the payments, all the invoices have been paid as a supplier, you provide this number normally, which you enter in the payment. We have VAT breakdowns, where we state for each category of VAT, we say which is the base amount and which is the VAT amount, and what is the rate. And sometimes, if there is exempt from VAT, we also have to provide exemption text. And then we have the invoice lines, where we have an invoice period. We have the price information, VAT information for each line, and then we have the product information with the name of the product or service, the description, seller, buyer, and standard identifiers, as is like the product numbers, item classification, possibility to use CPV or UNSPSC codes, and country of origin. And these are just examples of elements. And there is also, something called item attributes, which is an undefined list with attribute value pairs. So we can say, for example, if the product is a laptop, you can have item attributes defined by the supplier, saying internal memory 8 gigabyte, hard drive 60 gigabyte, weight 4 kilos, and so on and so on. And this list can be defined by the supplier. So in that sense, it's very flexible, and for most types of services and products, you can fit it into this model without having to extend or to make any changes to the standard. So that's the idea. So looking at, and there is a table with all these business terms in the document, and this is like the core information of the core standard. You have the invoice number, for example, here with a description and a usage note. It points back to what's the requirement behind this element. And also the business terms are numbered, so BT1, BT2, BT3, and so on. Here you can see if the element is mandatory or if it's optional, and so on. On a technical level, each business term also have a data type. So if is it a date, or is it an amount, or is it a percentage, and so on. And so that's for the information. But I'm also mentioned that there are rules, business rules, that connects the elements to each other. I said before, for example, if the invoice contains VAT amounts, then the supplier must provide the VAT number. It's a long list of these rules. And they are of different types. They call integrity constraints. There's one set of rules, making sure that all elements that are necessary are there. And then conditions where they are where the business terms relate to each other and are dependent on each other. So that's integrity constraints and conditions. And then finally, we have VAT rules. And there are a set of categories defined in the standard. For normal VAT, it's the standard rate, or rates. So I don't know how many VAT rates you have here. 2, 3? Three main ones, and they would all be standard rate, and then you have a percentage saying that this is 25 perhaps, and this is 12, and this is 6 perhaps in Sweden. And then you have other types of categories. We have for those that are exempted from VAT, where we have reverse charge, products that are 0 rated, and then we have some from Canary Islands. A bit surprising perhaps, but they have a specific tax VAT scheme there. And then finally, where VAT is totally out of scope. And for all of these categories, there's a set of rules for how to calculate, and should the VAT, for reverse charge, the rate must be 0, and so on and so on. So it's a very, even though this is complex, it's also testable. So someone who is implementing this standard can test its invoices against a conformance tool to see that it's following all these rules. Otherwise, it would have been very, very hard to make sure the quality is good. So, just to give you a few examples of questions which the standard gives answers to, I've turned this around because in some other workshop or trainings that we had, all the participants had their own copy of the standard, and then these were exercises But now I'm just giving these as examples of questions. And these are examples of questions that actually have been sent to the CEF support. So these are real-life questions, which we are using in the trainings. So, for example, the one that I mentioned before, we use 2 types of domestic payment systems plus IBAN. Can I state all 3 types? And looking in the standard is the payment means repeatable? No, it's only one. Okay, so sorry, can only state one. Which document types can be attached to an invoice? So PDF or Excel spreadsheets or so on. That is also something that the standard defines. There is a limited list of types of documents that all receivers must be able to handle somehow. And PDF is one of those. So you can have, for example, if you have a timesheet for a consultant, that could be submitted as a PDF inside the invoice, so it's submitted together. Which elements should be used for a reference to the customer, similar to your reference in an invoice? So this is something also an important element used for referencing and workflow support, so that the invoice is presented directly to the correct person in the receiver side. And so there is a business term for that. And then we use reverse charge. Should the tax amount always be 0? That was also a question that came to the CEF support team. And the answer is yes, it should always be 0. You can find it in this and that rule. So, yes, that was some example. I hope you have got a kind of a feeling for what type of information the semantic model contains. So it's been being a little bit demystified. Okay, so this looks perfect. We now have a European standard for how to do invoicing. So, but then there are a few disappointments also where one I need to present to you. And as I mentioned, it's hard to get these 30 countries or 25 or supporting the work to agree on all details. In some cases, we have an element which in Italy say, yes, this element must always be in the invoice. Otherwise, the invoice is not legal in our country. The supplier must always provide its organization number, for example. And then Ireland comes and says, we don't have organization numbers. And it's hard to find one set of rules that is acceptable for everybody. And the way to wiggle out of these discussions, where there was just, we must, we can't, was to leave it open in the standard and then have a mechanism for the countries to squeeze it up, to make it mandatory again. So Italy could go back and say, okay, the standard doesn't require it, but we can require it when we are implementing the standard. So that was a way of wiggling out of these discussions where we didn't reach consensus. However, that also means on a cross-border level in Europe, sending invoices cross-border, but also for those providing tools that are going to be sold in many countries at the same time, they have to take care and understand all these specific domestic rules. So that's a consequence. And the usage specifications, that's the mechanism. So the standard describes a mechanism for how to restrict the standard so that it follows, for example, domestic peculiarities. And what makes this tricky is if I ask you then, how do I comply to the European standard? What does it mean for me as a receiver to comply to the standard? And then you would go to the directive, because you read there that the receiver must be able to process invoices which comply with the European standard. Okay, so if I'm an Italian receiver, and this element must always be present according to their implementation of the standard. So if I receive an invoice where this information isn't available, the standard says it's optional, but in Italy it's required. And if they receive an invoice where it's not there, can they say that they're compliant with the standard? Do you follow me? The problem? So you would then go to the standard and see, okay, what does it mean to comply? And there is a section there where it says, a receiving party may only claim compliance to the core invoice model if he accepts invoices that comply with the core invoice model in general, or with a SIAS that is itself compliant with the core invoice model. So either, as a receiver, you can implement the standard in full, or you can implement the SIAS. And you are English native speakers, so you see this or, it opens up for a choice. So as a receiver, I can claim compliance by implementing the full standard, or I implement just my domestic standard. And this then becomes a challenge, of course, from an interoperability perspective. It's there by purpose. It was a way of coming to a conclusion with the standard, and we have to live with that. So now it's just finding measures to get as many as possible to use the same approach, so we don't get one specific SIAS in every member state. That would be a nightmare for everybody, because then we don't have one common standard. These SIASes, the core invoice user specification, they can then, as a summary here, can be used to enforce restrictions on how to use the standard. A SIAS must always be a subset, so you can't add stuff, you can't add requirements, so you must always additionally send this business information, which is not mentioned in the standard. That's not allowed. So you can only make restrictions to further restrict the standard. That's allowed in a SIAS. The simplest type of that kind of restriction could be that the seller must provide a contract reference. That's something that you normally just put in a contract or in your agreement with the supplier. You could technically create a SIAS where this element is mandatory. And then you would refuse any invoice that doesn't have a contract reference. It's a very, very destructive approach because you would, there are other ways of verifying this. But there could be more complex restrictions, such as worst case, you can only send the 99 invoice line to us because that's our limitation and this is our SIAS, so you have to follow that. Very bad idea, and so on. So then the question is, why do we bother with these SIASes? Shouldn't we just implement, you as public entities, just implement the standard as is? Yes, that sounds like a way out of all of this, but on the other hand, there are some challenges in that the standard doesn't give enough detail. For example, it allows for some code lists which are very, very long, quite complex to implement, both for the sender and the receivers to learn about and to implement. So there is a real need, actually, to create a usage specification. The CEF team has started to collect projects for where these SIASes are defined. There is one, the first one, is the PEPL SIAS. PEPL has its own SIAS of the European standard, where it mandates the identifiers for the buyer and the seller so that they can be reachable in the network. That is one of the things that's been restricted the standard says it's optional with these elements, but in PEPL you must have them, otherwise you will not be able to find where the receiver is located, so you can send an invoice through PEPL. So that's an example of a restriction which PEPL has mandated these identifiers. PEPL has also restricted the number of invoice type codes to a more sensible set, because the standard allows for invoice type codes which are really out there, really not used or make much sense. PEPL has limited that list. And there is a few other things that are primarily for simplification so that the invoice can be used without bilateral agreements between the buyer and seller. So it should be more plug and play. So PEPL SIAS, it's published. It says development here. It's an old screenshot, but it is approved and published. It will become mandatory in PEPL to use this. And then we have a number of other SIASes being developed. All countries that is connecting to PEPL must at least provide support for the PEPL SIAS. Then you can additionally have other SIASes. So for Ireland and for you as public entities, you will all be implementing the PEPL SIAS if you are connected to PEPL. The same goes for Sweden and Norway and Denmark, if I understand it correctly. So this will likely be the most used SIAS. So the reality is never as perfect as it first seems. But with the PEPL SIAS, we at least get the same specifications for many countries in Europe, and perhaps depending on the success of PEPL, at some point all countries in Europe. So then you could consider this to be the European standard, in a sense. Okay, so let's look at how the plans from some of the countries where Christian and I have been and have these workshops, where we know people, where we asked what are they doing today and how are they going to implement the transposer directive and so on. All of this information, in almost all cases, are tentative. So these are just, I cannot guarantee that these countries will not change their mind and do something else. All these strategies are still being formed. But looking at, starting with Denmark, they have 98% of all invoices are already electronic. And they are using the UBL syntax today, which is one of the syntaxes on the list. And they have this NEM-handle, which Christian mentioned, as their infrastructure on how to exchange documents. In the future, they are going to support PEPL SIAS, and they're going to provide some, for domestic suppliers, they will have some extra rules. So if you're a Danish supplier, then you also have to do provide some extra information perhaps, but it will be based on the PEPL SIAS. They will use PEPL and NEM-handle in parallel, and what we understand is that long-term it will be only PEPL. They have a legacy in NEM-handle since with 98% of invoices. It will not be a switch overnight. All public entities will be connected to PEPL. That's at least for cross-border, that helps a lot. And for legislation, e-invoicing is already mandatory, but the directive also makes it affects some types of public entities that are currently not under this law, like I think publicly owned companies, which is now also included. In Sweden, we have 50-60% electronic invoices. It's going up, but we are not mandating it currently. So this is much of the efforts from the public sector. They have been, actively chasing the suppliers. Can you please send us invoices? Or they put it in the contracts that you must. If you win this bid, you will have to provide invoices. So that's the approach. As you can see, with that more optional approach, even though we've been doing this for almost 20 years, we still haven't reached more than 50-60%. Due to the fact that, and that could be also that some municipalities have 80% electronic invoices, others have 0 or 5. So it's very much up to the champions. So do you have someone in your organization that really believes in this, and then they work for it? You have a strategy, and some municipalities, they have no strategy at all, or resources. So it's very, very different. UBL is the main syntax, and we have various infrastructure. We haven't had a clear policy on any minimum requirement on, it's more market-driven approach. So we have, in Sweden, kind of a mess. So you might end up having to connect to several services to be able to send to all your customers. So there's not one highway like PEPL currently. We are going to use the PEPL SIAS, and we are going to mandate all public entities to use PEPL, just like in other countries, and I understand also in Ireland. Yes. Recommend. Okay, recommend. And this will be there will be, I don't know the English word for it, but we have the law, which is going to mandate electronic invoicing, and then we have some additional. No, it's a little bit higher. It's almost a law, but it's only for public sector. Regulation. A regulation which says that the public sector must be connected. So it will be in that way. And then, so it will also be both above and below threshold. So we will also have almost 100% invoices after April next year. Norway, they have 70-80% using UBL, and they jumped directly on PEPL. And the reason why they have much higher than Sweden, I would say, comes very much to clear policy on how to exchange. So it's much simpler. Everybody can connect using the same technology. They are going to use the PEPL SIAS and continue, of course, to use PEPL. They are still discussing, to my understanding, how to do the transposition. They are potentially going to mandate it on the suppliers, at least partly for some types. Netherlands, here the central government has 50%, regional, local, almost nothing. They use UBL. They have a central hub, and they also are using PEPL today. This is not clear yet how they will handle this. They're going to use PEPL SIAS, but they're also working on a country-specific SIAS. For the future, they are going to use PEPL, and the transposition is like here, that as is from the directive. And yes, and then going to mandate on the central government to require e-invoicing in new contracts. So that is a way of, like the middle way. Furthermore, Australia, similar. The federal government 50%, and the rest they don't know. Probably they don't collect that information. They are using a domestic XML format, a domestic e-invoicing format, and UBL. They have central service with web form and upload functionality of invoices, but they're also connected to PEPL. All governmental authorities are using PEPL. They are creating, as it looks now, 2 different SIASes, one for the government and one for the rest. And PEPL is going to be used for cross-border. And they're going to continue with this approach for infrastructure, and they are implementing the directive as is. So I don't have 30 of these slides, so you don't have to be worried. Cyprus, they have no e-invoicing today at all. They're going to use PEPL, and they're going to implement the directive as is. Oh, I have one more. Poland, similar to, nothing today, going to use PEPL. And we have Croatia. Very, very little today. Centralized solution. They are going to use PEPL. They are also planning on a domestic SIAS with translations to the language and things like that. And PEPL plus a central service for uploading. That's all. I'm not going to bother you with more of these slides. But you can see that at least it looks a bit biased towards PEPL. But that is also because that's where the countries that we have visited so far has some strategy to use PEPL, and then it becomes looks like this. Then there are other countries that have no clue yet. They haven't decided, or they have some other thoughts. And so if we would have one slide for every European country, you would have seen more strategies than these. But still, I think it gives a good picture, both for a few countries that have been working for a long time with e-invoicing, but also for those who are completely new to invoicing. So main takeaway so far from our implementation workshop is that things are really happening. When we started a year ago, there was no sense of urgency at all. People were curious, but it stayed at that. Now people are starting to get a little bit panicked. So you can see that, and a lot more interest. There are these sciences being developed, but the PEPL science seems to be the one that is mostly referred to and used. And the understanding and knowledge is also picking up in the member states. Also the insights into what the standard means and how to implement it is getting better. Of course, as you have probably in your problem in many of your organizations, that you don't have the management backing on some change processes. Similarly, is it in some member states where it's unclear which ministry should be the policymakers, who should own the issue of e-invoicing. And sometimes, okay, it's obvious who should do the transposition of the directive, but who should take over the operational aspects of helping the government and helping the public entities and all of that. And still, no one have the resources. And in some countries, these organizations have been in place for a long time with the operational support teams and all with training programs, and so it's a big difference between different countries. And yeah, it's the responsibility. And obviously, too, that on a national level, there is a lack of expertise, both when it comes to the European standard. It's new, it's only been available for a few months or a year or so. So it takes time to build up the expertise for training services or also the service providers. It needs to pick up a lot here. So with that was my last slide on the European standard. So, thank you.